If you don't know about flyer deals on Instacart, this message is for you. Flyer deals are like strolling through your favorite store looking for deals, but you're scrolling your phone, and maybe you're in bed. Because getting delivery doesn't mean you have to miss deals like you'd get at the store, like the one creamer that doesn't make your stomach hurt, or the pasta sauce you can't not buy when it's on sale. So download the Instacart app, shop flyers, and never miss a deal on one of your favorites. Plus, get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes.
Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Here we're going to dive into a historical case that not only shook London, but also laid the foundation for how courts across the world handle criminal insanity. This is one of those rare moments in legal history that forced the system to rethink how it treats mental illness in criminal law. And it's a case that still sparks debate to this day. In 1843, Daniel Macnaghten, a Scottish woodturner, carried out a crime that shocked the nation. He shot and killed Edward Drummond, the private secretary to British Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel. But here's the twist. Macnaghten wasn't aiming for Drummond. He thought he was assassinating Peel himself. Why? Because Macnaghten was suffering from severe delusions, convinced that Peel was orchestrating a conspiracy against him. So in his mind, he wasn't committing murder. He was defending himself from a plot from the government. What followed was not your typical murder trial. This case wasn't just about whether or not Macnaghten pulled the trigger. This was about his mental state at the time. The court was forced to grapple with questions that went beyond the facts of the crime. Was Daniel Macnaghten fully aware of his actions? Or was he so consumed by his delusions that he could not tell right from wrong? The trial's outcome established what we now call the Macnaghten Rule, a legal standard for determining insanity in criminal cases. This rule set the precedent for how courts evaluate the mental capacity of defendants, and it's still used today in many legal systems around the globe. But this ruling wasn't without controversy. Many people felt that Macnaghten had escaped justice, believing he should have been punished regardless of his mental state. Others saw it as a landmark moment, a step forward in understanding how mental illness impacts criminal behavior. This case was a turning point for both the courts and the public. It raised the question, how do we balance justice with compassion for those who are suffering from mental illness? And here we're going to examine that balance closely. So stay with me as we unravel the complex details of the Daniel Macnaghten case, a case that will have you questioning whether justice was served and whether Macnaghten was mad or just bad. The question of insanity in criminal law wasn't entirely new in the 19th century, but the Daniel Macnaghten case thrust it into the spotlight in a way the courts had never seen before. Up until this case, British law had no clear guidelines for determining whether a defendant should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. And in this case, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The verdict wouldn't just determine Macnaghten's fate, it would set a legal precedent that would influence courts around the world for centuries to come. So here's the key question. Was Daniel Macnaghten truly insane at the time of the murder? Or was he simply using mental illness as an excuse to avoid punishment? And we've seen this before, but this case is so important because this is what set the tone for everything after that and how we use it all today. So let's first take a look at the facts leading up to the actual crime. Daniel Macnaghten was a Scottish woodworker who lived a relatively quiet life in Glasgow. But in the years leading up to the shooting, his mental state began to deteriorate. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that agents of the British government were following him. He believed these agents were part of a conspiracy orchestrated by Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, who, in Macnaghten's mind, was intent on ruining him. These delusions consumed this man's thoughts, and despite having no evidence to support any of those thoughts, MacNaughton believed them to be absolute truth. What's interesting about MacNaughton's case is how gradually his mental state deteriorated. He didn't go from a stable functioning individual to an assassin overnight. His delusions developed over time, and in the months before the murder, they intensified to the point where he believed his life was in imminent danger. He became convinced that his only way to stop the persecution was to kill Sir Robert Peel. On January 20th, 1843, that's how old this is. That's how far back this question goes. But all right, January 20th, 1843, MacNaughton traveled from Glasgow to London with a pistol. He had no history of violent behavior, mind you, yet on that day, he followed Edward Drummond, Peel's private secretary. He thought that actually was Peel himself. He followed him in broad daylight in the bustling streets near Whitehall. MacNaughton raised the gun and shot Drummond in the back. The bullet didn't kill Drummond immediately. He succumbed to his injuries a few days later, though. MacNaughton was arrested right there at the scene, and when questioned, he calmly explained that he believed he had killed Peel and that he had done so to protect himself from further persecution. He really believed this. It was a targeted assassination attempt, albeit with the wrong victim, but it quickly became clear that this was not a straightforward case. MacNaughton's defense team argued he wasn't even in control of his actions, and they claimed that he was suffering from such severe delusions that he could no longer distinguish reality from his own paranoid fantasies. Because to MacNaughton, this was not murder. This was self-defense against a government conspiracy. Of course, it didn't exist anywhere but in his mind, but this is what he's going off of. And this argument raised a crucial question that had never been addressed by the legal system before. Can someone be held criminally responsible if they were mentally incapable of understanding their actions? MacNaughton's defense team argued that he should not be found guilty because his mental illness had made it impossible for him to understand what he was actually doing. The idea of criminal insanity was not new, but it had rarely been tested so publicly in British courts. Historically, insanity defenses were sporadically used, but there were no clear guidelines. How could a jury determine whether someone was truly insane or simply using their mental state as a convenient defense? What constituted insanity? And how could the law establish a consistent framework for evaluating a defendant's mental state? This wasn't just a question of law. This was a question of morality and justice. Should society punish someone who, because of mental illness, could not fully comprehend the nature or the consequences of their actions? The MacNaughton case forced the courts to confront this issue head-on. The trial itself became a high-profile event, even back then. Medical experts were called in to testify about MacNaughton's mental state. Some doctors argued that he was suffering from paranoid delusions so severe that they clouded his perception of reality. They explained that MacNaughton genuinely believed that he was acting out of necessity. He believed that his life was in danger and that killing Peel was his only way to stop the persecution. Other experts, though, disagreed, suggesting that MacNaughton's ability to plan and carry out the attack indicated a degree of intent and awareness. After all, he had purchased the pistol in advance, traveled to London, and waited for the right moment to strike. These actions, the prosecution argued, showed premeditation, regardless of his delusional state. But I ask you guys out there, of course he planned this, because in his delusion he still needed to do all these things. So I think sometimes the questions throw us off as well. In his delusion, he knew he needed that pistol because he knew he had to kill someone. Does that excuse him, though? Because in the real world out here, you cannot just take a pistol and go kill someone. And this wasn't just a debate in the courtroom, and that's why it's here with us today. The public followed this trial very closely, and opinions were very divided. Many people believed that McNaughton had gotten away with murder, and they viewed the insanity defense as an excuse for avoiding justice. In their view, McNaughton should be punished for his actions, regardless of his mental state. Others, however, saw the case as a necessary step in recognizing how mental illness affects behavior. They argued that it would be unjust to hold McNaughton accountable for a crime he didn't fully understand he was even committing. And this is where the debate over insanity versus accountability comes into sharp focus. Should a person be punished if they lack the mental capacity to understand the morality or legality of their actions? And how should the legal system handle cases like this in the future? Basically, this case was carried out inside of a delusion. How do we handle situations like this? Well, very carefully. McNaughton's case set the stage for legal reforms that would have lasting implications, not just in Britain, but around the world. The outcome would lead to the creation of the McNaughton Rule, which established a legal framework for determining insanity in criminal cases. According to this rule, a defendant could be found not guilty by reason of insanity if, at the time of the crime, they were suffering from a mental disorder so severe that they could not understand the nature of their actions or distinguish right from wrong. But here is the real question. Was Daniel McNaughton truly insane? Or was this a case of someone who used their mental illness just as a way to escape responsibility? And should society treat mentally ill defendants differently when it comes to serious crimes like murder? This case did not just affect Daniel McNaughton's fate, it reshaped the justice system and the way we think about mental illness in the context of criminal behavior. The ripple effects of this case can still be felt today in courtrooms around the world. Let's look at the facts of this case. We really need to dive into both his life before the crime and the critical events that followed his arrest, because this case didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It was a product of McNaughton's deteriorating mental state, a flawed understanding of mental illness in society, and the way the legal system dealt with criminal responsibility at that time. All right, so let's get into Daniel McNaughton, his background, and his mental state. He was born in Glasgow, Scotland, back in 1813, and by trade he was a wood turner, a profession that required focus and precision. For most of his life, he lived quietly and without incident. However, those who knew him reported that as he entered his late 20s, his behavior began to change. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances started to notice that McNaughton had become more withdrawn. He no longer interacted with people in the same way, and he seemed to live in a state of increasing paranoia, which is never awesome. The sources we have from that time, though limited, indicate that McNaughton began to believe he was being followed and persecuted by mysterious forces. This paranoia gradually grew worse until, by the early 1840s, McNaughton had become fully convinced that the British government was orchestrating a conspiracy against him. And at the center of this imagined plot was Sir Robert Peel, the British Prime Minister at the time. McNaughton believed that Peel had sent government agents to track his movements, watch his every step, and ultimately destroy his life. These delusions were deeply ingrained in McNaughton's mind, and there was no one around him who could offer help. At the time, mental health care was virtually non-existent, really. People suffering from severe mental illness were often misunderstood. I mean, if we think they're misunderstood today, just imagine. And conditions like paranoia and psychosis, they were rarely treated in any kind of meaningful way. As McNaughton's mental state worsened, he became fixated on the idea that he needed to take action to stop the persecution that he believed he was experiencing. His delusions grew to the point where he thought that the only way to protect himself was to eliminate the man he held responsible, Sir Robert Peel. By January of 1843, MacNaughton had reached a breaking point. Convinced he was in danger, he made the decision to travel to London and carry out what he believed was an act of self-defense. He acquired a pistol, left Glasgow, and traveled to the heart of Britain's capital. On January 20th, 1843, MacNaughton arrived in London. He began to follow a man he believed was Sir Robert Peel. In reality, this guy was Edward Drummond, Peel's private secretary. Drummond was a well-known figure in political circles, but to MacNaughton, he was the enemy, the face of the conspiracy that had haunted him for years. Drummond had no idea he was being followed, and as he walked near Whitehall, a busy area filled with government buildings, MacNaughton approached him from behind. With little warning, MacNaughton raised his pistol and fired a single shot into Drummond's back. Drummond collapsed immediately, and nearby bystanders rushed to his aid. The scene was chaotic as people tried to comprehend what had just happened. Drummond, though gravely wounded, did not die immediately. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, and doctors did everything in their power to save him. But despite their efforts, he did succumb to his injuries a few days later on the 25th. His death sent shockwaves through British society. A high-ranking government official had been shot in the street in broad daylight, and the man responsible for the crime had been caught almost immediately. MacNaughton didn't flee the scene. He was apprehended by a group of bystanders and police officers within minutes of the shooting. When questioned, MacNaughton didn't deny the crime either. In fact, he openly admitted that he had shot the man he believed to be Sir Robert Peel. He calmly explained that he had done so because Peel was at the center of a conspiracy to destroy him. This statement, coupled with MacNaughton's apparent lack of remorse or emotional response, raised immediate questions about his mental state. It became clear to the authorities that this case was not just a simple assassination attempt. Something far more complicated was at play. In the days that followed the shooting, investigators began to look into MacNaughton's background. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. MacNaughton had no prior criminal record. He was not associated with any political movements, and there was no indication that he had any personal grievances against Sir Robert Peel or Edward Drummond. Instead, what emerged was a picture of a man whose life had been overtaken by delusions and paranoia. Witnesses who knew MacNaughton testified that in the months leading up to the shooting, he had become increasingly withdrawn and fearful. He had spoken of being followed by government agents, and he seemed genuinely terrified of the conspiracy he believed was targeting him. However, there was no concrete evidence to suggest that any such conspiracy existed. To the investigators, it became clear that MacNaughton had been acting under the influence of a delusional belief system, one that had driven him to commit murder. Despite this, the fact remained. A man was dead, and Daniel MacNaughton had pulled the trigger. The question facing the court would not be whether MacNaughton had committed the crime. He admitted to doing it. Instead, this trial would focus on whether MacNaughton could be held legally responsible for his actions given his mental state at the time. From the beginning, it was clear that the MacNaughton trial would be unlike any other murder trial of its time. The defense did not deny that MacNaughton had shot Edward Drummond. There was no attempt to argue self-defense in the traditional sense. Instead, the defense team focused on MacNaughton's mental condition, arguing that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense team called upon several medical experts to testify about MacNaughton's mental state. These experts described MacNaughton as suffering from severe paranoid delusions, a condition that made it impossible for him to understand the true nature of his actions. They argued that in MacNaughton's mind, he genuinely believed he was defending himself from a government conspiracy, and that belief made it impossible for him to distinguish between right and wrong. At the time, there was no legal standard established for how courts should handle cases where the defendant's mental state was in question. British law had no clear framework for determining insanity in criminal cases, and the MacNaughton trial would set a precedent for how such cases should be judged in the future. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that despite his delusions, MacNaughton had demonstrated clear signs of premeditation. They pointed out that he had acquired a pistol before traveling to London, and that he had deliberately followed Edward Drummond before shooting him in broad daylight. These actions, the prosecution argued, showed that MacNaughton was capable of planning and executing the crime, even if his motivations were rooted in irrational beliefs. In the end, the jury found Daniel MacNaughton not guilty by reason of insanity. He was not sentenced to prison, but instead committed to a mental institution where he would spend the rest of his life. This verdict sent shockwaves through the British legal system. In the wake of the trial, Queen Victoria herself expressed concern about the implications of the ruling. Could future criminals use the insanity defense to escape punishment? How could the courts be sure that a defendant was truly insane, rather than simply faking mental illness to avoid responsibility? In response to these concerns, the British legal system moved quickly to establish a clear standard for the insanity defense. This led to the creation of the MacNaughton Rule, which became the foundation for determining criminal insanity in future cases. According to the MacNaughton Rule, a defendant could be found not guilty by reason of insanity if at the time of the crime they were suffering from a mental disorder that made it impossible for them to understand the nature of their actions or distinguish right from wrong. This rule would go on to influence the legal systems not just in Britain, but in many other countries around the world, and it remains a cornerstone of the insanity defense to this day, though it has been refined and modified over time. The public reaction to the MacNaughton verdict was deeply divided, and it still is today, right? When people want to claim insanity, people are always divided. Back then, some people believed that justice had been served. They saw MacNaughton as a man who was clearly mentally ill and who should not be punished for actions that he couldn't control or understand. Others, however, felt that the MacNaughton case was a case where the criminal had escaped justice, and they feared that the insanity defense would be abused by future defendants looking to avoid punishment for their crimes. In the years that followed, the MacNaughton Rule became a subject of both praise and criticism. On one hand, it provided a much-needed framework for handling cases where the defendant's mental state was in question. It allowed the courts to recognize that mental illness could, in some cases, impair a person's ability to understand the nature of their actions. This was a significant step forward in the legal system's treatment of mental health. However, not everyone was convinced that the rule was the perfect solution. Many felt that it left too much room for manipulation. Critics argued that the standard set by the MacNaughton Rule was too narrow, focusing solely on whether the defendant could understand the difference between right and wrong. And they contended that mental illness is far more complex than that, and we know that today, and that the rule failed to account for the many ways in which a person's mental state could impact their actions. This debate persisted throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and over time, various legal systems sought to refine or replace the MacNaughton Rule. In the U.S., for example, the Durham Rule was introduced in 1954, offering a broader definition of insanity by stating that a defendant could not be held criminally responsible for their unlawful act if it was the product of a mental illness. The Model Penal Code, developed in the 60s, also introduced a more nuanced approach, focusing on whether the defendant had the capacity to appreciate the criminality of their conduct or to conform their behavior to the law. Despite these developments, the MacNaughton Rule remained in place in many countries, including the United Kingdom, where it continued to serve as the foundation of the insanity defense. Even where it has been replaced or modified, the rule's influence is undeniable. It was the first formal attempt to address the issue of mental illness in criminal law, and it laid the groundwork for all subsequent legal discussions on the subject. Beyond the specifics of the McNaughton case, the ruling had a profound impact on how courts around the world approached mental health in the context of criminal responsibility. Prior to this case, defendants who claimed insanity often faced inconsistent outcomes. There was no standard legal framework for evaluating claims of mental illness, and judges and juries were left to make subjective decisions based on limited knowledge and experience. The McNaughton rule provided a more objective standard, making it easier for courts to assess whether a defendant could be held responsible for their actions. It also prompted a broader conversation about the role of mental health in the justice system, encouraging legal professionals, lawmakers, and medical experts to consider how mental illness should be treated in the context of criminal behavior. One of the key legacies of the McNaughton case was its influence on the development of forensic psychiatry. And just think of how big that field is today. As the field of psychiatry grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, medical experts became increasingly involved in criminal cases where the defendant's mental state was in question. The collaboration between the legal and medical communities that began with the McNaughton case laid the foundation for modern forensic psychiatry, which plays a crucial role in today's criminal justice system. More than 180 years after Daniel McNaughton shot Edward Drummond, this case continues to resonate in courtrooms around the world. The questions it raised about the nature of mental illness, the extent of criminal responsibility, and the balance between justice and compassion are still debated today. In recent decades, high-profile cases involving the insanity defense have brought renewed attention to the challenges posed by the McNaughton rule. For example, the trial of John Hinckley Jr., who attempted to assassinate U.S. President Ronald Reagan in '81. It reignited debate about the insanity defense in the U.S. Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and his acquittal led to public outcry, prompting some states to tighten the requirements for using the insanity defense. Even with these changes, the core principles established by the McNaughton rule remain intact. Courts continue to wrestle with the same fundamental questions that emerged during McNaughton's trial in 1843. How should society treat individuals whose mental illness has driven them to commit crimes? Should they be held accountable for actions they may not have fully understood? And what safeguards should be in place to prevent the abuse of the insanity defense? Despite the legal framework that has evolved from the McNaughton case, there are still many unanswered questions about the relationship between mental illness and criminal responsibility. The McNaughton rule focuses on the defendant's ability to distinguish right from wrong, but modern understandings of mental illness suggest that this binary approach may not capture the full challenge of mental health. For example, some mental health conditions can impair a person's judgment or impulse control. Even if they are technically aware that their actions are wrong, in such cases, the strict application of the McNaughton rule may fail to provide an adequate legal defense for individuals whose mental illness does not fit neatly into the categories of right and wrong. This has led to ongoing debates about whether the legal system needs to develop more nuanced standards for determining insanity in criminal cases. Furthermore, the public's perception of the insanity defense remains complicated. While many people recognize the importance of taking mental illness into account, there's still a widespread belief that the insanity defense is overused or that it allows dangerous individuals to escape justice. High-profile cases like McNaughton's, Hinckley's, and others have contributed to this skepticism, and it makes it difficult for courts to strike the right balance between compassion and accountability. The Daniel McNaughton trial did not just center on the facts of this crime. Those were clear. McNaughton had admitted to shooting Edward Drummond, thinking he was the prime minister. The real question was whether McNaughton could be held legally responsible. So let's look at the arguments that were presented. For the prosecution, they built their case around several key points, but the most important thing was premeditation. They argued that McNaughton's actions leading up to the shooting demonstrated a clear intent and awareness. For example, he acquired a pistol, he traveled from Glasgow to London, and he followed Edward Drummond. And they also sought to discredit the idea that McNaughton was completely out of touch with reality. They argued that even if McNaughton's beliefs about the government conspiracy were irrational, he still had enough control over his actions to plan and carry out this attack. So in their view, McNaughton's ability to follow a sequence of steps, acquiring the weapon, traveling, etc., showed that he understood what he was doing, even if his motivations were distorted by delusions. And then, of course, one of the most compelling points raised by the prosecution was that McNaughton had shot the wrong man. They argued that this demonstrated some level of awareness because had McNaughton been completely detached from reality, he might not have been able to recognize anybody at all. The fact that he was able to identify Drummond and mistake him for Peel showed that McNaughton was still functioning at a level that allowed him to make conscious decisions. The prosecution had a very well planned out and strong argument on their side. Now, the defense, though, they built their case around the fact that McNaughton was suffering from paranoid delusions, and they were so severe that he could not distinguish between reality and fantasy. They called in several medical experts to testify about McNaughton's mental state, and these experts argued that McNaughton was not in control of his actions, and this was because his mind had been overtaken by his delusions. And they presented a picture of a man who had become so obsessed with the idea that the government was targeting him that he could no longer differentiate between what was real and what was imagined. One of their strongest points was that he really did believe he was acting in self-defense. He thought Sir Robert Peel was the mastermind behind a plot to destroy him. The defense also countered the prosecution's claim of premeditation by emphasizing that planning alone does not prove sanity. They acknowledged that McNaughton had acquired a pistol and he had traveled to London, but they argued that these actions did not necessarily indicate that he was aware of the moral consequences of his actions. Instead, they suggested that McNaughton's delusions had driven him to take these steps, and that he believed he was acting rationally within the framework of his own distorted reality. The real clash between the prosecution and defense here came to a head in the testimony of the medical experts. Both sides brought in doctors and psychiatrists to try to analyze McNaughton's mental state, and they had conflicting views, and it reflected the uncertainty surrounding mental illness as a whole in the 19th century. And this battle of expert testimony highlighted the difficulties the court faced in trying to make sense of mental illness. At the time, psychiatry was still a relatively new field, and there were no clear guidelines for determining how mental illness should be treated in the context of criminal responsibility. And this jury was left to weigh the conflicting testimonies and decide whether McNaughton's delusions were severe enough to excuse his actions. And how qualified was the jury to understand any of this? It was very difficult, and while the legal battle raged on in the courtroom, there was the public, and they were deeply divided over the use of the insanity defense. But in the end, the jury sided with the defense, and they found Daniel McNaughton not guilty by reason of insanity. And this verdict was a pivotal moment in legal history. It's a very big moment. It set the stage for the establishment of the McNaughton Rule, which would become the standard for determining criminal insanity. This verdict did not just affect McNaughton's fate. It had far-reaching implications for the legal system as a whole. It forced the courts to recognize that mental illness could, in some cases, impair a person's ability to be held accountable for their own actions. But of course, it also sparked a debate that still continues to this day. How do we balance justice with compassion? How do we ensure that the insanity defense is not abused? This case was not the end of the story here. It was just the beginning of a much larger debate that we are still dealing with today. The decision to find McNaughton not guilty by reason of insanity was controversial at the time, and it still continues to raise difficult questions about that intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility. The establishment of the McNaughton rule created a framework for dealing with insanity cases in the courtroom, but it also opened the door to controversy. The controversy surrounding the McNaughton case also highlighted a deeper issue: the role of public perception in shaping the legal system. This is a real thing, and it's still happening today as well. I mean, at the time, the public was divided. Some viewed McNaughton as a victim. Others thought he had taken a life and he deserved to be punished. The tension between compassion and justice became a recurring theme in discussions about the insanity defense. On one hand, there was a growing recognition that mental illness should be treated differently within the legal system. On the other hand, there was a persistent fear that allowing mental illness to excuse criminal behavior would weaken the rule of law and undermine public safety. This split in public opinion is something that still plays a significant role in high-profile cases involving the insanity defense. In many cases, media coverage can influence how the public perceives a defendant's mental state. Does not mean it's right. Sensationalized reporting can sway public opinion, and the public is completely unaware of this, creating an emotional reaction that may not align with the actual legal facts. And this makes everything challenging. The McNaughton case showed how difficult it can be to recognize legal standards with the court of public opinion. And that challenge is still here today. One of the most lasting controversies surrounding the McNaughton rule is its simplicity. The rule asks a straightforward question: did the defendant understand the difference between right and wrong at the time? While this seems like a reasonable standard, many legal scholars and mental health professionals have argued it does not capture the nuances of mental illness. It's not black and white. Some individuals may be aware that their actions are wrong, but they still feel compelled to act because they have a distorted sense of reality or overwhelming delusions. The McNaughton rule, critics argue, does not account for those nuances. It focuses too narrowly on this single aspect of mental illness, whether the defendant knew their actions were wrong, without considering any other factors like impulse control or the capacity to make a rational decision. This limitation has led to the development of alternative legal standards, like the Durham Rule I mentioned and the Model Penal Code, both of which take a broader view of mental illness and its impact on criminal behavior. However, the McNaughton Rule still remains influential in many legal systems, and the debate over its effectiveness continues. And all right, as we've explored this case of Daniel McNaughton, one thing has become clear. This case raised questions that are not easy to answer. In 1843, the court found McNaughton not guilty by reason of insanity, setting a legal precedent that would shape criminal law for generations. But the verdict left many people conflicted, and it still does. Now, after hearing the facts, the arguments, and controversies surrounding this case, it's time for you to take a look and decide. On one side, we have the argument that mental illness can profoundly affect a person's ability to understand their actions. Medical experts testified that Daniel McNaughton was suffering from severe delusions. In his mind, he was defending himself from a government conspiracy led by the Prime Minister himself. From this perspective, how can someone be fully accountable for a crime they didn't even realize they were committing? The defense presented a compelling case. McNaughton believed he was acting because he had to. He was trying to protect himself from a threat But that threat only existed in his mind, but it was real to him. He was gripped by paranoia, so powerful that it overtook his sense of reality. Should someone in that state be treated the same as a criminal who full-on knowingly and deliberately takes a life? What do you think? Because on the other hand, we have the argument that MacNaughton's actions, despite his mental state, still resulted in the death of an innocent man. Edward Drummond was walking through the streets of London when his life was cut short by a single bullet. From the prosecution's perspective, MacNaughton had planned the attack. He acquired the pistol, he traveled to London, he followed Drummond, and he fired the shot. These were deliberate actions, even if MacNaughton's motivations were rooted in delusion. As you reflect on this, all of this, consider the impact of the verdict on society as a whole. The court found MacNaughton not guilty by reason of insanity, but many believed he should have been held responsible. They worried that the insanity defense would become a loophole for other criminals to avoid punishment. But even if we consider that, is it still fair to the mentally ill? How do we ensure that justice is served while recognizing the challenges of mental illness? As we wrap up this episode, let's take a moment to consider the legacy of the MacNaughton rule. The rule has shaped how courts handle insanity defenses, and it has for nearly 2 centuries. But it's not without critics. Some argue it's too rigid, focusing solely on whether a defendant can distinguish right from wrong, without accounting for the full complexity of mental illness. Others see it as a necessary safeguard, ensuring that those who are truly insane are not treated the same as those who knowingly break the law. The legacy continues to evolve as courts and lawmakers, they grapple still with new understandings of mental health. We are always learning more about mental health, but at its core, the MacNaughton rule remains a pivotal moment in the history of criminal law. A moment that forced society to confront difficult questions about justice, mental illness, and responsibility. So as we close this case, I leave you with this. How do we create a legal system that is both just and compassionate? And where do you think the line should be drawn between holding someone accountable for their actions and recognizing the impact of mental illness? Thank you for joining me today as we explored the Daniel MacNaughton case. This case may be over, but the questions it raised are far from settled. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay thoughtful, and remember, justice isn't always as clear-cut as it seems. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.